everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it, especially with all of these technical advances. I'm getting adjusted. I'm glad everyone else has gotten adjusted too, so thanks for joining us. I just want to give this opportunity to Lydia Ozuna because I know that we had planned a convening event in Fort Bend County for the postponed upcoming public input hearing that was supposed to be on May 9th. I'm assuming that also is going to be postponed probably until later in that month. I haven't heard yet from the House Redistricting Committee yet as to whether or not they have decided to cancel it. So I did want to give this opportunity though to Lydia so she can say hi and introduce herself because she's the one that put all of this together. So Lydia.
Thank you, Stephanie. We're really excited. We were very disappointed that we couldn't hold our original 23rd of March convening in Fort Bend. But it turns out, you know, every cloud has a nice big silver lining. And it turns out that now we've been able, in collaboration with our partners, which are Fair Maps, League of Women Voters in Texas, League of Women Voters Fort Bend, to regroup and make it a 5-part series, which is even really more exciting because it'll take us through the same agenda that we had originally. And the bonus is now we have our mapping component also as part of the series. And it's really made it a lot easier in some ways to handle. So welcome to everybody, and we hope you stay with us throughout the 5-part series, and we promise that when it comes to mapping, you will really appreciate these other parts of the series. And to give you a highlight for those in Fort Bend, on April 20th, we're going to be focusing on Fort Bend County and what the demographics trends are showing us there and what part they will play in redistricting in 2021. So welcome.
So because this is part of a rescheduled event, I didn't put together an agenda. I didn't think that far in advance. I have my Redistricting 101 presentation ready. But let me go through a quick agenda so everyone knows what's in store for this evening. So we're going to go through just the redistricting background information tonight. And so this hopefully will give you an idea of what our current redistricting process looks like, to, why it's so bad, and what we can do to fix the system. And then next week on that call, I will be covering just a few slides on the public input hearings and what your testimony should include. And Joaquin Gonzalez from the Texas Civil Rights Project will be covering the rest of it. And he will be explaining some of the advocacy items that we have been pushing for throughout the public input hearings, and explain why it's important that we advocate for those issues. So I guess, okay, so for tonight's call, let me go back. For tonight's call, the call is going to be Redistricting 101, and then the second half of the call, we're going to devote to current events. And that's usually, that is what the agenda for the Fireside chats will look like. So we combined our weekly chat with this presentation, so we can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. So please stick around for the current events portion of the call, but if you don't have time, that's understandable. For the current event tonight, we're going to be talking about what's going on in Wisconsin, because you betcha it involves gerrymandering. So yeah, I hope you guys stay around. But let me get started on the Redistricting 101 talk. This is a talk that I give quite frequently when we go. We have been touring the state, getting cities ready for the public input hearings that both the House and the Senate will be holding. So we've mapped out and we've kind of followed their tour around the state. And so this is, yeah, designed to get you the background information that you need to be able to understand what sort of testimony, basically, actually what the redistricting system looks like, so you know what your testimony should look like, if that makes sense. Sorry. Okay, so I am Stephanie Swanson, by the way. I'm with the League of Women Voters of Texas. I'm the issue chair of redistricting. I basically manage our redistricting advocacy efforts at the state level. So thank you guys so much for joining us. And of course, now the slides aren't going to work. Okay, there's a delay. So hopefully I don't get too far ahead of myself in this. So if you would like to become a member, here is our website. Please go to the website to find out how to join. If you join, your membership dues go to pay for more events like this, because yes, there was a slight fee for this event, but it enables us to do a lot of other great stuff as well. So yeah, please consider joining us. Okay, so let me see if I can minimize this. So, okay, I'll start off on the talk. Redistricting is one of the most important processes in our democracy because it determines the power of your vote. It determines how your community is represented, which other communities will be included in your district, and ultimately who will be elected to represent you. That elected official then turns around and makes very important decisions about the quality of the air you breathe, the quality of your water, the quality of your child's school, and how much you pay in taxes. So we need to have the public aware of what's going on during the redistricting process, and we need them to be involved as much as possible so we can draw maps that reflect our communities, so we have a cohesive voice of representation. So why do we need districts? I want you guys to drop yourself back in time to like the 1800s and pretend like you're going out to West Texas to set up a town. Who can tell me some of the first things you're going to need to find when you get out there? Maybe a water source, maybe a way to grow food, a way to build a house. After you have a house, maybe you have a small collection of houses that show up. And soon enough, you'll have a school, maybe a grocery store, maybe a few businesses in the town. And so soon enough, that small town might even grow into a city, and that city will eventually have a shared culture. And so that is what we refer to as a community of interest. And communities of interest, what you want to have is, like I've mentioned before, a cohesive voice of representation, representing your needs at the legislature to make sure that you get everything you need to, for your city to exist, basically. So I'm going to go through some of the basic rules for redistricting, so you kind of have that in the back of your mind as we walk through all of this. So there are just 2 federal guidelines for redistricting. Our districts must be equal in population, and this goes back to the Reynolds versus Sims ruling in 1964. It was a Supreme Court case. And at that point, the Supreme Court said that our districts must be equal in size, basically equating it to 1 person equals 1 vote. And so ever since that point, though, it's complicated the way that we draw districts. We'll get to that more later in the talk. But in today's age with computers and big data, that's really, really complicated the way that we draw districts. Okay, the second federal guideline is the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was established in 1965. I can never remember 1965, 1964. It basically requires that legislators draw districts that do not dilute the power of minority representation. So basically, we cannot use racial gerrymandering. We cannot use race as a factor when we draw these districts. For state guidelines, we have just 2 state guidelines in Texas for our Texas legislator, or Texas legislative lines. Our state house districts have to follow the county line rule. And what that means is that if you can fit one whole district in a county, then you cannot cross county line. That really complicates the way, doesn't complicate, I actually think it makes it a little more difficult to draw house districts, but it does make them more compact. So that's one saving grace of this rule that we have. So another thing that we have to keep in mind is that our Texas Senate districts must be single member and contiguous. but there's no requirement for compactness in either the Senate, the Texas State Senate, or the congressional districts that we have. Okay, I'm gonna leave it there in case it goes to the next slide. So what districts need to get redrawn? First of all, when I give this talk, I usually like to say what happens first is that we have a census. So we're in the middle of the census right now, and there's a good reason that we have to take the census. It's to know how big our population has grown and where those changes in population have occurred. I usually ask the audience at this point, how many people have moved from another city in the past 10 years or even from another state? I'd say more than half the audience, not half the audience, maybe like a third of the audience has. So there's a good reason that we have to take the census every year so we can track those changes in population. Because like I mentioned earlier, we need to be able to draw districts of equal size, but more importantly, we need to know where we need to send our resources, right? If we want to effectively govern our population, we need to be able to accurately size the population and know where to send resources. So after we take our census and we figure out where our population lies, the next thing that we need to do is redistrict. So what districts need to get redrawn is our US congressional districts, our state legislative districts, our state board of education, all the way down to the local level. So our city council districts need to be redistricted, even water boards and school boards. Who is responsible for redistricting at the state and congressional level? It's our state legislators. So the Texas legislator will redraw our state legislative districts and our US congressional districts, as well as the State Board of Education. The bright side is they do hold public input hearings around the state to collect input from the public on where their communities are located. That is something somewhat unique about Texas that doesn't occur in other states across the US. The maps, keep in mind, are passed as regular legislation. And so what does that tell you? That tells you that whoever is in control of the legislator at the time that that legislation goes through is going to have a outweighed say in what the maps look like, because it's the legislators themselves that are drawing those maps. So currently right now, Republicans are in charge of the redistricting process. In 2021, we're coming up to an election year. So this election year is pretty important. It's going to determine who is in charge of redrawing those district maps in 2021. And so keep in mind, though, that the governor has the last say, right? So even though it's the legislator that passes that legislation, the governor is the last person to sign off on the maps. And so because of this, even though there is a chance Democrats might take over the House, it's still the governor that's going to have to pass that legislation for the House maps. And most likely, if Democrats take control of the House, he's not going to be willing to sign off on it. And in that case, what's going to happen is most likely it's going to be punted to the courts. However, I'm going to take you a step back. So if we have gridlock in the legislature and we cannot pass either our House or Senate or congressional map out by the end of the legislative session, which is, I think, May 31st, the backup commission is going to get called. And so the backup commission right now consists of just 5 people. It's the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the House, the comptroller, the attorney general, and the land commissioner. And so currently all 5 of those people are Republican. So that kind of tells you how skewed our backup commission is. And then not only that, but it only requires 3 of those people to agree on a map, agree on a plan to vote it out of the commission. Good news is that the backup commission can only touch the state legislative districts. They cannot touch the congressional districts. So like I was saying, if Democrats do take control of the House coming up in 2019, or I'm sorry, at the end of 2020, then most likely what will happen is that the congressional maps will get punted to the courts instead. If that made sense at all, sorry. There was one more thing I wanted to tell you guys about this whole process. Oh, I wanted to tell you about our crazy Texas legislative session. It's very old-fashioned. We only meet once every other year. And then not only that, we only meet for 5 months. So our session starts, I think, like, the beginning of January, but we cannot start hearing bills until, oh gosh, I think it's the end of February. So we actually have a very short amount of time to actually get legislation through the legislator. And I think the reason for it back then was because they knew legislators were going to get up to no good, and they wanted to minimize the amount of time that they were in office and getting bills passed. But that really now has complicated how we get our maps passed, right? It becomes a very partisan process. Whoever's in control will put pressure on the other side saying, we want you to agree to these maps right away. Otherwise, we have the backup commission waiting. And if you don't agree to what we say, we're going to kick it to the backup commission, basically. So it's a very delicate process, and it's very restricted on the amount of time that we have to get these maps developed and passed. So how is the current process so bad? Because what I've laid out like before this, as far as our federal guidelines and state guidelines go, they're pretty simple, right? So we just had 4 guidelines. One person, one vote, follow the Voting Rights Act, follow the county line rule, and then for our Senate districts, they have to be multi-member districts, right? So that seems like pretty simple stuff. It seems like it'd be pretty simple to draw a map based on those criteria. So where is the process going bad? And the answer is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is redistricting gone wrong. It is a practice of drawing district lines to favor one group of people over another. And we have 2 types of gerrymandering that exist right now, which complicates it even further. So we have both partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. So I'm going to talk about racial gerrymandering first. Racial gerrymandering was supposedly outlawed by the passage of the Voting Rights Act way back in 1965. Racial gerrymandering is still a very significant problem in the United States. Even though they say that they have outlawed it, you still find a lot of instances, especially here in Texas, of racial gerrymandering still being in existence. Partisan gerrymandering is still allowed by the Supreme Court. So last year we had a big Supreme Court case that they finally ruled on. We've brought partisan gerrymandering before the Supreme Court a few times this past decade. And finally, this last time, the Supreme Court said, this is too much of a political question. We don't want to overstep our boundaries. We're going to let partisan gerrymandering still be in existence, which was a very big disappointment to a lot of people. And the reason why it was such a disappointment is because race and partisanship go hand in hand. You cannot have partisan gerrymandering without racial gerrymandering. And so the fact that they allowed partisan gerrymandering to stay is a very big blow to the Voting Rights Act. And then we had a further complication with a Supreme Court case from Texas. I'll get into that a little bit later in the talk. So one of the big questions that you get that I've presented at the bottom of the slide is, redistricting versus gerrymandering. Is the purpose of redistricting to facilitate a representative democracy, or is it to improve partisan advantage? And so that is what the Supreme Court now has left up for states to decide. And so many states don't behave themselves, and that's where we're getting into problems. So the big question is, does gerrymandering translate into a partisan advantage? And so I have 2 cases here, 2 instances to show you. So back in the 1990s, it was Texas Democrats that really heavily gerrymandered against Republicans. So much so that 1992 redistricting, that partisan gerrymander that I'm showing you, was considered the 3rd worst in US history. And this is according to certain mathematic models that they've developed to analyze gerrymandering. And anyways, okay. So if you take a look in 1992, this is for the US congressional race, 50% of 50% of the people voted for Democrats, but Democrats controlled 70% of the seats. So now come up to 2018, Republicans are in control now. So Republicans in this past US congressional race won 50.4% of the votes, but they managed to capture 63% of the seats. And so that skew, those extra seats that either party have captured over the years, that is because of the way that the district maps have been drawn. And so today in 2018, Republicans right now have an extra, I want to say when I did the math, it was 3 to 4 congressional seats, even possibly higher, maybe 4 to 5. So how are the maps drawn? Because it's 2020 now, I keep having to remind myself of the year. I feel like I'm getting old. So because it's 2020 and because we have big data and because we have such sophisticated software available, legislators don't necessarily draw the maps. A lot of times what happens, and they always say, yes, we do, but I want to reassure you that that's not always the case. That might be the case here in Texas, but that's not the case. That's not what happened in Wisconsin and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and any of the states that were involved in Project Red Map. If you stick around for the current event, we'll go into more details about that. So what really happens is consultants actually have big data available and they have sophisticated software and they can go block by block and choose their voters. They meet behind closed doors. And they do not have to consider the public's input. A lot of times they don't even have to consider legislators' input. Mainly who's doing it is a national party. And they're doing it to give the party an advantage, basically, a very large electoral advantage, to make sure that they have a very large control of elections for the next 10 years. Oh, let me go back to the diagram really quick. So on the screen, I have a picture of Congressional District 35. That's on the left, and on the right, you can actually go in and see. So they've actually cut Texas State University right down the middle of campus. And so the way that the district lines are drawn here caused a lot of confusion on Texas during the 2016 election on Texas State University. So the students there were very confused about where the precinct was. The county hasn't adopted county-wide polling centers yet. So you had a lot of students that would go to one polling location on campus only to be told that they need to go to the other. Not only that, but the lines for those polling locations were very long, some of them exceeding 3 hours. So they would stand in line for 3 hours, get up to the front to vote, and they'd say, no, you can't vote here, you have to go across campus. And so because of that, and because of all the confusion and all the problems that they experienced, the Texas Civil Rights Project, which is one of our coalition members, stepped in and sued. They threatened to sue the state. And so because of that, they extended early voting on campus so all of the students could cast their vote. But that's the type of problems. And if you look at that map of San Marcos, they really have gone block by block and chosen their voters. So sometimes there's a good reason for why districts are drawn that way. And I have to admit that Congressional District 35 was probably one of those districts. So sometimes civil rights groups will get together, well, they won't get together, but they will try to draw a district to give their community of interest a voice of representation. So Congressional District 35 was apparently drawn by MALDEF. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with MALDEF. MALDEF is the Mexican American Legal Exchange and Defense Fund. I can't remember the name of it. Basically, they're representing the Hispanic and Latino communities, making sure that they have access to voting and that they get proper districts and that they don't get manipulated or shut out of the voting box, basically. So MALDEF actually drew this district with the purpose of trying to give the Hispanic and Latino communities a voice. But when they drew this district, I really highly doubt that they included the public in this process. So they came in and they drew this district based on simply on race. And in the process, a lot of people in both Austin and San Antonio are very, very upset with the way the district that turned out. This district at the top is Austin, and on the bottom side it's San Antonio. Neither of these communities have a lot of stuff in common, I would say. So remember at the beginning of the talk when I said, why do we need districts? Imagine you're going out to set up a town. Well, these are two separate towns, and they don't really actually have much in common, the areas that they've selected. So in 2017, the federal district court actually ruled this district to be a racial gerrymander, but that's a long and complicated story. So what happened was the state adopted this district saying, all right, we realize there's been a lot of growth in our Hispanic and Latino population over the last 10 years. We need to at least draw one district. And so they adopted that district with that intent. But when they did so, they purposely did it to minimize the voice of the Hispanic and Latino community statewide, if that makes sense. So really what should have happened was there probably should have been two districts drawn, and that's not what happened. The district on the right is the same story. So that district was drawn for a reason. This is the Illinois' 4th district, congressional district up in the Chicago area. They drew this district, it's called the earmuff district, to give that population a voice. And so this district on the south side, I think it was like Latino, on the north side it was Puerto Rican, and they drew that district thinking that that group of people would vote cohesively as a voting bloc to elect a candidate of their choice. And that district actually has allowed that community to elect a candidate of their choice. So sometimes these funny shaped districts have a meaning, right? They have a purpose behind them. So all of the stuff that I'm talking about revolves around packing and cracking, and I'm going to explain that really quick. So for cracking, I always give an example of Travis County. That's where I am right now. And so Travis County, for the longest time, it was actually the House District of LBJ back in 1947. So it's been this very democratic pillar surrounded by a sea of red, basically. So Travis County for the longest time included most of Travis County in its congressional district. And then in 2003, when Tom DeLay got a hold of the redistricting process, that no longer held. And immediately what Republicans stepped in to do is they started cracking. They started splitting up that whole county and mixing it in with a more rural vote, which tend to vote conservative. And so on the right, I show you what our current district map looks like now. It's 2017. This is what the map looks like. So despite Travis County voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016 at a rate of 62%, we only have one congressional legislator, congressperson that's a Democrat, and that's Lloyd Doggett. So we have 5 congressional seats in total. The other 4 go to Republicans. And if you look at the map, you can see how all of our districts start kind of in the center of Austin, and then they spread out from there. So they literally have cracked our voice into 5 different counties, diluting our voice of representation. So let me go back because I want to explain packing really quick. And unfortunately, Congressional District 35, which was drawn by MALDEF, is an example of packing. But again, I want to emphasize that MALDEF had good intentions when they drew that district. They were trying to give the Hispanic and Latino community a voice of representation. And so that district, if you can see on the left, that purple color on the map is actually Hispanic and Latino, but packing means that you pack as many constituents of a certain group into that district, so you ruin their voice of representation statewide. And so, like I said, MALDEF had good intentions, but the state took that district and ran with it. What the state should have done is instead taken this district and added to it and added more majority and minority seats in the process. Majority minority means that it's the name of a type of district involving the Voting Rights Act. And so a majority minority district means that a majority of the district consists of minority voters. And that's all it means, in case that didn't come out clear to begin with, sorry. Okay, so remember me saying that race and partisanship go hand in hand. Here's kind of my proof for that. So I want you to look at the very last 2 first point. I stole this from the Texas Tribune. I haven't cited it, sorry. So Texas consists of 50% of people of color, but I want you to come up and look at what the composition of people of color are in the state legislature. Our state legislature only consists of 36% people of color, and that is because of partisan gerrymandering. The state has efficiently used partisan gerrymandering to, for lack of better words, screw over people of color, because people of color tend to vote Democratic. So what problems does gerrymandering create for everyone? And this isn't always obvious to people until I point it out, until we start talking about it. So legislators will draw a safe district for themselves. And what I mean by safe district is that when you look at the electoral margin of the district that they won in, that it was won by more than a 20% margin. And that's how bad it is in Texas right now. I think on average, their safeness, that electoral margin, is around 30%. So that's how badly we're gerrymandered now. But when you draw a safe district where a legislator is guaranteed to win, a party is guaranteed to win, what that means is that the voters cannot hold them accountable at the ballot box anymore, right? We can't vote that legislator out of office during the general election. If we want to vote them out of office, we have to go to the primary. So over on the left, you can see that the election is moved from the general election to the primary. And when that happens, there's no compromising anymore across party lines. The candidates don't have to do that. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They have to pander more to the extremes in order to win the primary, because what happens is the most passionate people in the party turn out to vote, and the most passionate people most of the time tend to be the more extreme. This also causes a problem. It causes incumbents to be reelected. It becomes hard to find challengers in those races, and as a result, races go uncontested. And because there are so many uncontested races, I know that wasn't true in 2018, but in 2016 that was the case, and I'll show you statistics for that on the next slide. But because so many races go uncontested, then why show up to vote when you know how the race is going to go, right? And that has an effect on down ballot races. So how bad was it in Texas in 2016? So 81 out of the 150 House seats, the state House seats, were completely uncontested. That's pretty bad, right? That's really bad. It was one of the worst in the nation at the time when I pulled the data. 66% of the state legislature was determined before a single vote was cast in the general election. And so I want you to think about that, because I think you need 60%, 62%, I don't know how much it is, to pass a bill in the legislature, right? Voters could not hold most elected officials accountable at the ballot box. If you wanted to vote someone out of office or vote for someone else, you had to go to the party, and that means you might have to cross party line. 72% of the state legislative offices were considered heavily gerrymandered with an electoral margin of greater than 45%, virtually ensuring victory. And 97% of incumbent politicians were reelected in the 2016 general election. So that's pretty bad. That doesn't look like a democracy to me right now. So what's our way out of this? Because all of that looks really bleak. And so we were hoping that the Supreme Court was going to give us a way out of it. We had another Supreme Court case this past year, in 2019, I should say. I don't remember the name. It was Rousseau versus Common Cause, or the League of Women Voters. And so we wanted the Supreme Court to step in and say how much partisan gerrymandering was too much. But the Supreme Court was waiting for someone to develop a way to measure what that looked like, because they don't know how to gauge that. And so we had a lot of mathematicians coming in, giving their opinion on what that should look like. But the Supreme Court said that basically all of these mathematical models are too complicated for us to understand, and we want to stay out of the realm of partisan gerrymandering. They will continue to hear racial gerrymandering cases though, and so that is the one good thing. One thing I did not mention that I usually mention at the beginning of the talk though, is that in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And so they removed a lot of protections that we had before then. And so right now the Voting Rights Act isn't very strong, and we're about to go into the next round of redistricting with a lot of the protections that we had before 2013. They're not going to be there anymore to protect us. So one of the ways out of this is to create something called an independent redistricting commission, or a nonpartisan citizens redistricting commission. And many states are moving to this model. I wanted to walk you through what that looked like, but I wanted to let you know that getting such a commission here in Texas might be more difficult than in these other states. So up until 2 weeks ago, all of the states that have set up such a commission had access to the ballot initiative process. We don't have that here in Texas, right? We can't put items on the ballot for people to vote on. California, and I think 25, I want to say 19 or 25 other states have that power. We don't have that power here in Texas. And so all of the states that have these sorts of redistricting commissions have access to the ballot initiative process. That being said, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, Virginia was the first state to pass a constitutional amendment. So there is hope. We have a long battle in front of us, though, is a point that I'm trying to get across. And it's not going to be as easy and clear cut as it was in Virginia, despite, you know, in Virginia, it was a very long and arduous process. So what the redistricting, a citizens redistricting commission looks like. So I'm going to walk you through what the process looks like in California. California is this, has great legislation that they've adopted. One of our board members, not our board members, but Common Cause has a board member here in Texas, a US board member that actually helped write that legislation. And it is like bar none, by far the most, what am I trying to say, eloquent process the whole way through. So they've really thought out where legislators can have influence, and they've tried to kick them out as much as possible. Okay, so on this commission, you're gonna have 14 people, 14 or 15 people, and it's gonna be balanced of partisanship. So you're gonna have 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 independents. And the way that they choose the commissioners is very extensive. So in California, for example, they had 30,000 people apply to sit on the commission. And from there, what they did was they applied a very strict list of conflicts of interest. So you couldn't have worked in a legislative office. You could not have been a legislator, first of all, worked in a legislative office, tried to, I'm at a lack right now. You couldn't have lobbied for them. You couldn't have consulted for them. You couldn't have had any previous connections with them, basically, nor could your family members. Also, you could not have donated more than $2,500 to anyone's campaign. You could not have worked for a state party as well, and been anywhere on the staff. And so by the time they applied that strict conflict, that list of conflicts of interest to their applicant pool, they actually whittled down their list of 30,000 people to 2,500, which is pretty significant, right? That's pretty astounding. And so from there, it was like a job application. And I think even one of the last steps that they used to pick the commissioners, they actually drew names out of a lotto hat. But that was just for like the first half. And then the second half, they tried to balance the diversity of the commissioners. So it was a very extensive process. One, to remove influence of legislators, and then also to pick legislators that reflect the diversity of the state. From there, the commission actually went around the state and held public input hearings. And what was so important about this is that this is the point where they got input from the public on what they wanted their districts to look like. And in California, they really highly prioritized communities of interest. And so communities of interest, like I told you about earlier in the talk, picture like you're going out to West Texas to set up a town. What are some of the stuff that you need to worry about to set up this town? Those resources are what we refer to as communities of interest. And so these commissioners went around the state and they held 32 hearings. At most of these hearings, hundreds of people would show up to give their input. Some of them even 1,000 or more would show up at times. Everyone was excited because in California, up until this point, you had gridlock. Basically, The only thing that Democrats and Republicans could agree on was what their maps would look like that would ensure their reelection for the next decade. Literally was the only thing that they could agree on. So people were excited. They're like, oh my God, we're going to get a say in this process. This is great. So they showed up at the public input hearings to give their input. At the public input hearings, that was the only time that the legislators could draw the maps. If they drew the maps outside of those public input hearings, they would webcast them. So there was a whole transparency component involved. Not only that, but the commissioners themselves weren't allowed to talk to legislators or consultants or lobbyists or anything like that. So it was a very unique and revolutionary way to draw districts in America. And it was very effective, actually. They actually, after they used that commission to draw their maps, they saw a record number of turnovers in seats, changing parties and just incumbents being kicked out, basically. So IRCs ensures that voters have a choice at the ballot box. In 2016, voters in all but 8% of the districts in states with commissions, sorry, let me minimize that, had 2 or more majority party candidates on their congressional ballots. And then I've already gone through what it will take for us to get such a commission here in Texas. And so that's kind of where I'm going to stop, because we're going to talk about the public input hearings next week. I just wanted to give you a quick preview though. For next week, we're going to be talking about what your testimony should look like. So that input on communities of interest is what the legislator is looking for. And so I'm going to give you an example of some testimony that I pulled from the California Redistricting Commission, and walk you through that and what all you should think about putting into your testimony. So yeah. Really quick, does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Stephanie, Jeffrey has a question. Is it true that an alternative to the current District 35 would likely result in there being no minority majority district in the region? Or what would the optimal fair modification be that would comply with VRA?
That is not something that I can answer. That would be Joaquin. I don't know enough about the demographics there. I do know that what we're trying to do though, so MALDEF is very interested in drawing, because they drew Congressional District 35 to be a majority minority district, but the purpose of that was so they could elect a Hispanic or Latino candidate. And that's not what happened. The congressional district there, they chose to elect Lloyd Doggett. And so that was one of the reasons the legislator chose that district as well, is because they were trying to get rid of Lloyd Doggett. But Lloyd was a strong enough candidate that he won that district. I do know though that we are working with groups on the east side of San Antonio, and what we would like to do, at least the groups on the east side of San Antonio, is form more of a coalition district, or multiple groups, the Black community, Hispanic, Latino communities on that side of town get together and say, we don't care who's elected, Black or Hispanic or Latino, but we would like that candidate. We all can agree that that's who we would like to support. But Joaquin Gonzalez next week can answer that question more thoroughly than I can, hopefully.
There's another question. Where can I find old district boundaries for my area, Denton County?
Is that current district boundaries or older district boundaries?
It says old district boundaries. Antonella, you want to address that?
Yeah, I'm just curious because you showed for the area around Austin. So what if I want to find out the history of Denton County? You know, I'm just curious to see how it changed in time.
The ACLU actually has a very good tool that shows you the evolution of the districts over time, and it doesn't allow you to inspect them up close and personal, but it does show you which regions of Texas that your district has encompassed over the years. I can try to send that out in the follow-up email. Let me make a note of that so everyone has that link.
Stephanie, Leola, are you still on? Leola Ross? She did some research for us here in our area. And I mean, she's a librarian. So she came up with maps from, I don't remember how far back. So the other thing I will commit to doing is asking her to give you the resources that she used to do that kind of search.
Does anyone else have any other questions? No? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to try to see if I can exit out of this. I've actually prepared, there we go, another presentation, which is all words. I'm sorry I threw this together at the last minute, but I wanted to talk about the current events that's going on in Wisconsin because they're very applicable to gerrymandering, actually. So I wanted to start by saying that we have been working with the production crew that put out a new movie. It's called Slay. It's a documentary called Slay the Dragon. And so I got a sneak peek at the documentary before it was released last Friday. And so I knew about the backstory behind what happened in Wisconsin. So on our Facebook page and in the newsletter I sent out today, there is information in there on how you can access the documentary. Because of the coronavirus, they've been forced to release it on demand. And so right now you can rent it, I think, for $7. Also, at the beginning of May, just to let everyone know, we plan on having a watch party, and the first 75 to 100 people or so that sign up for the watch party will get a free link. So if you want to wait until the beginning of May, that's an option. If you don't want to wait and you're really interested in watching it now, I encourage you to do so. They need to, reclaim some of the money that they've lost from the coronavirus and not being able to release the film into the theaters. But it's a very scary film that shows how gerrymandering has eroded our democracy, basically. And one of the states that they feature is Wisconsin. And so I'm going to walk you through the backstory about Wisconsin, the backstory about Project Red Map, because it all has a very big influence on not only President Trump's election, but also the fact that the Supreme Court allowed elections to continue yesterday in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak, and also how their state Supreme Court also mandated that the elections be held. And so I was very upset yesterday. It was a very emotional day. I don't know how many of you actually saw on your Facebook feed or any coverage of the elections. It was very upsetting. So I'll try to also include a video of that in the follow-up email. But one of the videos from the Washington Post that I saw, the line extended, I would say more than, oh gosh, it seemed like a mile. Honestly, it seemed like a mile to vote, right? So in Milwaukee itself, they're supposed to have 180 polling locations open and only 5. They can only find enough poll workers for 5. And I'm rather disappointed also in the Democratic governor who waited until this long to say, hey, wait a second, we have an election. Oh my God, what do we do? The whole state in general is very ill prepared for this sort of response. But it all stems from gerrymandering and Project Red Map. So I want to walk you through that right now. So Project Red Map was a ploy by the National Republican Redistricting Committee, whatever it's called. I don't know what it's called now. Anyways, the National Republican Party, basically, they had a Republican strategist, Christian Jankowski. I have a quote from him later in the slides that, with his full name, in case anybody's wondering. But, after the 2008 election, where Democrats swept office and Obama was elected, Republicans were very distraught, and they're sitting here thinking to themselves, what are we going to do? We've lost everything. And so this Republican strategist figured out that if they could take control of enough state legislators in 2010, they could take back control of at least Congress, basically, because in 2011, that's when you redistrict. And so after you redistrict, you then have control over state legislators for the next 10 years. And so what Project Red Map was they invested, the Republican National Party invested $30 million in very targeted strategic campaign ads in the 2010 elections. And the whole point, again, like I said, was to elect Republicans and to flip enough state legislators to take control of the redistricting process in 2011. So those campaign ads were very targeted. A lot of them are actually smear ads. Unfortunately, I don't want to say unfortunately, but you know, it was unfortunately, it was a very successful campaign. So what they're doing is they're trying to manipulate our democracy by taking control of the redistricting process. And so it was a very successful campaign. Apparently they were able to flip about a dozen state legislators, and that meant that those state legislators, the Republicans, would have control of the redistricting process in 2011. And so all of this is featured in Slay the Dragon, the documentary that I'm talking about. And it's a very dramatic retelling. They tell about the Flint water crisis because that plays a role in it. They tell about Wisconsin because in Wisconsin, it's just a horrible series of events that I'll lay out for you here. North Carolina is another state that they feature. Again, in North Carolina, there's been a lot of extreme legislation passed there as well. So it's a good movie to watch. It made me cry a lot. Okay, so step one was to invest in campaigns. Step two was to redistrict. So after they took control of the state legislatures, they then moved to redistrict. And when they redistricted, they gave Republicans a very extreme advantage in the legislature. So let me see what I have for my notes. Yeah, after they won these campaigns, they literally sent a letter to the new Republican leaders saying that their team would be happy to assist with drawing new district boundaries or providing resources to do so. Thomas Hoffler is one such famous consultant. That's a good example of who was involved in all of this strategy. They used very sophisticated software to maximize the political results of the maps. And big data had a very big part in that. And I want to emphasize that the software big data combination was something that hadn't been seen before up until 2010. And so in 2010, it was like gerrymandering on steroids, basically. So step three, after they won those state legislators and enacted new maps, because they had a lockdown on the legislator, next was they're going to enact an extreme legislation because these elected officials basically now are untouchable. You can't vote them out of office. They said, what do we have to lose? So this is the quote from that Republican strategist that I was talking about. This is the brainchild of Project Red Map. His name is Chris Janowski, and he's featured a lot in the documentary. And so this quote really stuck out to me. It's a little disturbing. It's from the documentary. Red Map for us was only the beginning. State governments like Wisconsin are little laboratories of democracy. Now that we've got control of them, we wanted to do something with it. And so it was very visceral for me. That's a very strong quote because, you know, with the power of redistricting, this is a very good example of what you have power to do. And that's all the more reason, in my opinion, why we should give it to the people, not legislators. So up until 2010, there's always been a 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was one of Red Map's targets, though. And so after Project Red Map in 2010, after they dumped a bunch of money into their state legislative races, the Assembly, the State Senate, and the governorship switched. So you had a complete switch from Democrat to Republican in the state. And then shortly after taking office, Governor Scott Walker introduced Act 10. Act 10 essentially did away with unions. It did away with collective bargaining for the public sector employees. And apparently in Wisconsin, that was a that was kind of part of a lot of Wisconsin, I don't know what their name is, Wisconsin citizens' identity. A lot of them were members of the union. And so at times after he proposed Act 10, the governor, you had a lot of protests going on in the street, and they show this in the movie a lot. And at times they said that some of the protests even drew crowds of more than 100,000 people. And what you come to find out is that this anti-union strategy was a coordinated plan from the National Party. And I think a few years later, the Supreme Court made some sort of ruling that really kind of severed the power of unions nationwide. So Act 10 passed in Wisconsin because Republicans had won complete control of the legislature after 2010, and Republicans were promised, if you pass this legislation, even though you have so many constituents breathing down your neck saying, don't pass this, this is so not right, we don't like this, we don't support it, even though they had so many constituents saying that, the people that were, the puppet masters saying, just pass it and we'll draw you a nice seat come 2011. And sure enough, that's what happened. And they show you in the movie that during these protests, there's this juxtaposition, because what happened was the legislator, not even members of, I don't know who it was. There were a handful of people that drew the maps. They did this across the street from the legislator. They drew it in like a dark office somewhere, and not even Republican legislators could see the entire map. When they came in, they had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They only were allowed to see their own district maps. And it was very, very hush-hush and secretive. And in the meantime, they're literally drawing the maps in this office building, and you have these huge protests going on down the street. So it's a very good documentary. It was very moving for me, at least. So yeah, definitely check it out at some point. So after the maps were redrawn, Republicans took a strong hold of the legislature. Maps were so good that during the 2018 election, Democratic candidates won 190,000 more votes for the state assembly, but the GOP held a 64-35 advantage. That's pretty bleak, right? That is pretty bad. So you saw this trend in states that were targeted by Project Red Map. You saw it in Pennsylvania, you see it in Michigan, you see it in North Carolina, and you see it in Wisconsin. In these states, there's rapid movement. So after they redrew the maps, so step one was fund these seats. Step two was let's redistrict. Step three is we're going to now enact a very extreme conservative agenda. So let me see what I pulled out from my notes. So there's very extreme conservative agenda. The one that I wanted to point out, number one, was the voter ID law. So the voter ID law was struck down by every single court that reviewed it because it had racial intent behind it. So many of these states, what they have done is they have modified the voter ID law, but it still is in effect disenfranchising voters, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. There's a lot of, in Wisconsin specifically, anti-regulation, anti-environment. They defunded public schools, disabled Planned Parenthood, pushed through conceal and carry and other pro-gun right laws, basically. And so in all of these states where Project Red Map was effective, all these states passed very similar legislation, and people are like, what's going on? All of these bills kind of look the same. And they figured out that the group behind this move was ALEC. ALEC stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council, and it actually is a bunch of corporations, I want to say. When they first started way back, I don't know, in the 50s, it was supposed to be pro-business, kind of anti-regulation, anti-environment, whatever, whatnot. But ALEC has changed into something quite different today, and it's very pro-conservative now. It's kind of strayed away from that pro-business model to be just more very right legislation. They draft model bills and they give them out to their legislators who are participants in this group. And those legislators are then responsible. They're supposed to go back and submit the legislation in their legislator and see that it gets passed, basically. So just so everyone knows, our committee chairman for the House Redistricting Committee was the former chairman of ALEC in 2015. So that kind of gives you an idea of the politics that we see now in the House Redistricting Committee. So the voter ID law, specifically in Wisconsin, going back to Wisconsin now, because that's what the current event is supposed to be about. So it disenfranchised upwards of 200,000 people, which is considerable considering that Wisconsin, I think, only has, I don't know how many people, a few million people in total. But this gap that you see of 200,000 people really has a tendency to sway elections. A lot of these elections for statewide offices were determined by 7,000 votes or something like this. So those most impacted were the Black community, especially in Milwaukee, where eviction rates are staggeringly high. Trump won Wisconsin by 23,000 votes. And going back to that last bullet point, I want to point out that right now with the coronavirus in Milwaukee and a disproportionate amount of people being affected is the Black community right now. And so there was a reason why Republicans wanted the elections to go through. It wasn't just merely, this is what needs to happen. There was a voter suppression element behind their motive. So an estimated 17,000 people were disenfranchised during that the 2016 election, the one where Trump won Wisconsin by 23,000 votes. The state is currently trying to purge, and this is what is so important about what's going on right now. So there is a very conservative group that's pushing a court case. And so they are trying to purge 240,000 people from the voter rolls using a method called voter caging. And so what the state has done is they've targeted Democratic precincts and they've sent voters in those precincts a mailer saying that you need to respond to this if you're a registered voter, otherwise we're going to purge you from the voter rolls. And so this results in a lot of people, I don't even look at junk mail because I would consider that junk mail. I always miss the census because I thought it was junk mail. So if you're someone like me and you don't pay attention closely enough, then you could be disenfranchised. So this decision, though, is trickled its way up to the state Supreme Court. And guess what? There is a state Supreme Court seat right now that is going to be that was in yesterday's election. And so that state Supreme Court seat is going to determine if this voter purge goes through. And so the justice up for re-election recused himself from the case, and this produced a 3-3 deadlock. And so there was a very good chance that the Democratic opponent might actually win. And so there was a reason why Republicans insisted on going through and holding the election yesterday. They were hoping that the coronavirus would suppress turnout. And based on the odds where they have used other methods of voter suppression mentioned earlier with the voter ID law, who knows what the turnout's going to be like. So even President Trump, to give you a better idea of this all kind of sounds like wild and speculation and crazy, but Trump was in the news yesterday tweeting about it, and he was encouraging people to go out and vote. And this specifically the Supreme Court case, the state Supreme Court says. So that tells you that this is kind of more than, letting the election stay to keep people's right to vote and stuff like that. This was more of a calculated plot by the Republican Party. So here's his quote: "Wisconsin, get out and vote now for Justice Daniel Kelly," the president wrote. "Protect your Second Amendment." At the daily White House coronavirus briefing, Trump was asked who should be held responsible for Wisconsinites if Wisconsinites become ill after standing in long lines to vote. And he said, "Look, all I did was endorse the candidate. I don't know anything about their lines. I don't know anything about their voting." And then when pressed on how standing in line to vote squared with social distancing recommendations, Trump said that Democrats in charge at the state level would have to answer to that. And right now, who is in charge? That's not correct. It's Republicans in charge. So I guess only time will tell to see what the fate of that election is. But that's a very important piece in this very complicated puzzle that the Republican National Party has dealt out over the past 10 years. So yeah, anyways, that's the end of the talk. And so,
there's one question, Stephanie, would you repeat the date for the movie showing that you're going to be sponsoring?
We do not have a date yet. We know it's probably going to be at the beginning of May, like maybe the beginning of May, maybe mid-May. And the idea behind it is you will get a link, like you'll sign up, we'll send you a link. You can go on and watch the movie at your convenience. And then we'll have some sort of like watch party at the end, like the weekly Fireside chat or something like that. One of our coalition members, Common Cause, is trying to find someone semi-famous to come out and be a part of that talk, like Dave Daly, who's featured in the documentary, or one of the other people from the documentary, to kind out to lead the discussion or be a part of the discussion at least. I can't make any promises about any of this though yet, so.
Okay, and will all of the people online tonight be receiving the email regarding all of this? Will you be contacting them?
On tonight's call, I'm not sure how you all were contacted or how you received notice about this. If you received it from Lydia, then yes, you probably will receive the invite. Because this was a rescheduling of the public convening that we had, we opened it up to the public and we didn't really take registration. Lydia, did you collect registration notices from people?
No, we didn't. We just sent out a general notice to try to get it out. So I'm on Facebook under this name. For those of you who don't know me, my Facebook page is public. Our Texas Against Gerrymandering Facebook page is also public. So you can send us a message through that to with your email address, and we'll add you to our contact list.
You can also quickly in the chat box with your email, and that will be recorded and listed. Also, another way is, and I won't take offense to this, but you can go to the Fair Maps Texas newsletter. So go to fairmapstexas.org, and on the front page, there's a place to sign up for the newsletter, and I will be sending notice out to our newsletter for people that want to watch it. And then if you want to wait around for that newsletter to come out and then unsubscribe, because I know people don't like junk email, I won't take offense. It's fine.
This is Brian Dungan. I have a question.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I have two computers sitting right next to each other, and so I was able to look it up on the other computers. I understand that the most recent redistricting suit was Abbott versus Perez, and I'm finding it hard to find out information about who the plaintiffs were and who their attorneys were. And I was wondering if those plaintiffs are ready to do it all over again in 2021, if unfortunately we have gerrymandering again, and if those lawyers are ready to do it all over again.
So there's a lot of mixed feelings about Abbott versus Perez. And so the Republican state legislator here in Texas used a very efficient method of stall and delay throughout that, the court cases basically. The main plaintiff in the case was Shannon Perez, and she was represented by, I believe, MALDEF. And so MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legislative Exchange, I can't remember, I'm getting it confused with ALEC, I think. At any rate, MALDEF is the person that drew Congressional District 35. MALDEF is still very active in the state, and yes, they probably would step in and sue again. However, I want to encourage you to look at what the outcomes were. Even Ross Ramsey, I think it was Ross Ramsey or Alexa Yora with the Texas Tribune, did a very detailed analysis in one of their articles. I can actually find it and include it in the follow-up email. They did a very detailed analysis of what the outcomes were of the plaintiffs trying to challenge, you know, a voting rights case in the midst of Shelby County versus Holder, with that ruling that weakened the Voting Rights Act in 2013, and what the final outcome was. And so the final outcome, when you look at it, is that it didn't do much good. And in fact, it actually somewhat weakened the Voting Rights Act even more. So after they gutted the Voting Rights Act, this was one of the first cases that came back up. Sorry, my dog's barking. So this is one of the first cases that came back up, voting rights wise, in front of the Supreme Court. And ultimately what happened was when they reviewed it, they said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and let what we did to the Voting Rights Act stand. And so it kind of further weakened what was left of the Voting Rights Act. Anyways, I'll send out that article by Alexa Ure or Ross Ramsey so you can get more of a full story of what happened here in Texas.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was some good information.
Sure. Hey, Jake, could you get the dog? Did anyone else have any questions? No? Does anyone else have any like lighthearted comments they want to add?
Stephanie, I do think of some things, but you did such a great job covering it, and I missed out on the early part of the call, so I'm afraid if I say something, it's already been covered. But anyway, so that's all. But you've covered it very well, and so you know, I don't really have anything to say after all for now, you know. But you got me wanting to watch that documentary. I know that because I marvel that legislators would roll over like that in Wisconsin. That's not a good sign. I mean, a legislator, it seems like a few of them should have said, who the hell are these people in this room drawing these districts, supposedly for us, you know, and that's a little disturbing to see that. And but indicative of some of the spineless reps that we tend to get, the more gerrymandered our nation gets, in my view, because you get more opportunists than you do free thinkers. That's just off the cuff. So look forward to seeing the documentary.
Yeah, the documentary was really, I already knew it was bad, but I didn't know how bad it was in other states. And after watching that, it's pretty bad. Kind of like what happened in California when the only thing they could agree on was they wanted to be reelected. So they all agreed on their
yeah. Well, or North Carolina, I had read something a while back where they actually pulled a stunt where there was, I want to say it was some kind of holiday, and a lot of the Democrats wanted to go to an event and so they said, we're going to go to this event, and they said, okay. And then the Republicans pulled a vote while they were away. And I'm getting it mixed up with, I remember years ago, Joe Gannon, whoever the Speaker of the House in the early part of the 20th century was, where they did a similar thing to get him removed. Of course, that's irrelevant to what we're talking about. But the more these shenanigans go on, you know, the closer we get to having things escalate, you know.
Yeah.
So
I think there's a lot of hope in our session for next week when we get information about how we can challenge the system and perhaps help it to work a little bit better and begin to make change that way.
Oh, that's always, yeah. Usually this talk is included with next week's talk. And so I always like to open it up with a bit of good news because a lot of people, after hearing the first part of the talk, are very depressed, and I don't blame them because it's a lot of information, and it's not good information to get through. It's not very optimistic, I would say. But one of the good things that happened this past year was, you know, the House committee, the House Redistricting Committee held organizational hearings. And at the first organizational hearing, they showed up and they said, we're going to have 3 organizational hearings. The point is to get the committee ready for the next round of redistricting. And importantly, we need to pick the cities where we're going to hold these public input hearings in the interim before the next round of redistricting. And so the chairman said, we're going to have 3 of these hearings. And at the 3rd hearing, we're going to invite testimony from the public, from groups like the NAACP and MALDEF and LULAC and anyone else, a voting rights group that wants to come in. Oddly enough, though, at the second meeting that they held, they adopted a list of cities without taking any input from the public. And I already had asked the Texas Civil Rights Project to prepare testimony for that third organizational hearing. And so when the committee showed up and went ahead and excluded the public from that decision-making process, they really started, raising a red flag, like what the hell is going on? So Fair Maps Texas, our coalition members, started writing letters to the committee saying, no, you can't do this, hold on, you need to include the public. Because the cities that they picked, basically it was very small. So 4 of the 14 cities they picked were Marshall, Lufkin, Rockport, and Beaumont, which basically encompassed 0.07% of our population, 0.7% of our population. And so in the meantime, our large metroplex areas, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin, only had 1 hearing apiece. And so we pointed that out to them and we said, you need to balance this more and you need to have at least guarantee to commit to having multiple hearings in our large metroplex areas, and they wouldn't do that. And so we caught them behaving badly. The state was being considered to be put back under preclearance. Preclearance was a provision of the Voting Rights Act that got removed in 2013, with the caveat that if the state behaves badly enough, a district court can choose to put the state back under preclearance. And preclearance means that any change in your voting laws would have to be approved by either the Justice Department or a 3-judge panel in DC. And so that includes your maps. And so because of the way the state behaved in our last redistricting cycle, a federal court was considering putting the state back under preclearance in 2019. And in that court case, the judge, one of the presiding judges on that 3-judge panel, came down and said, what makes me want to trust Republicans during the next round of redistricting? And he listed some of the stuff that Republicans did wrong in 2010. He said, you held public input hearings in locations that no one could find, like very small locations. You didn't post public notice. You didn't create an outreach plan, and you didn't show the public your maps, basically, and give them a chance to comment on them. So I took that quote from the judge and I took it to the statewide NPR. And I said, look, they're repeating the same things that the judge is calling out as mistakes. They're already repeating that right now. And so they ran a story on it. And literally within a week of them running the story, the House Redistricting Committee decided to expand the number of public input hearings that they had. They went from 14 public input hearings to 28. So there is some hope. We were able to catch them and push them and ask for more public involvement in the public input hearing process. So that was hopeful. That was our one shining piece of hope that we have that we're holding on to. We can't guarantee now, though, that the legislators are going to listen to our input. And so what Joaquin is going to lay out next week will be some of the details about what we need to be asking for and letting them know that we are watching and we want them to listen to us, and we want it to be a transparent process, and we want them to actually consider our input, and we want our input to be reflected in the maps. And so that's what Joaquin is going to lay out next week.
And one more thing, Stephanie, the Princeton Gerrymandering Project series of seminars, the one on Friday is dealing with also this topic of gerrymandering.
Oh, I can include that. Is that one of their series that they've planned?
It's called Fixing Bugs in Democracy, Organizing During a Pandemic. And the young woman presenting was one of the activists in Fair Maps.
Oh, was it Katie Fahey?
Yes, that's who it is.
Oh, good. She's also in the documentary. She's the person that led the redistricting campaign in Michigan. She led the
she's the one scheduled for Friday. And the man with her, Dave, somebody or the other, I forget his last name. He's also in the documentary.
Yeah.
He's the following week.
Daily.
Yeah, if you need to register today, though, I think, and you'll be able to access a link or a code to see the movie Slay the Dragon too.
Oh,
But you
really?
should register.
I don't know.
I think you need to register today.
Yeah,
So,
they're,
But with
they're
your
giving-
registration,
they send you a code and you have up until, I think it's either June or July to take advantage of it. So it's quite interesting. So anyway, thank you, Judy, for bringing it up, and Jennifer for having the information on it.
anytime.
Just a little note of inspiration here. If I'm not mistaken, Katie started her crusade in Michigan based on a conversation at Thanksgiving dinner with family or something like that, as I recall the story. And I met her in Denver when I went out a couple of years ago to a Unite America conference. Very dynamic lady for sure. So, but so little things or big things start small, as we all know.
Amen.
So, you're doing great, Steph. We're all quiet because you're doing a great job.
I think so.
The thing that I'm wondering about, and if you already covered it, don't feel like you had to, but where are we with the mapping software? And I know everything got blown up with the virus, but is there a way we could do that by way of email and so forth? Somehow engage in actually drawing maps?
So the plan was to buy District Builder, so everyone would have access to it across the state to draw their own maps. I'm not sure where that stands right now. Joaquin was the person that was researching that, and we had a conference call set up with the makers of District Builder a few months back. District Builder was revamping their software, and I'm not quite sure. They were supposed to be releasing it sometime this spring, and so that's kind of what the holdup has been. I need to check back. I've emailed him and I haven't heard back. I would say though for now that District R is probably just as good.
Okay.
District R is free, it's readily available. I can actually pull up actually if you just search for District R, DISTRICTR, and Tufts, you should find the link for it. Basically, it was produced by Tufts University by the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group. But it's software that's readily available right now online, and you can start drawing districts and messing around with it right now.
Great. That would be great. As many bright minds as we've got in this group, we could call out Alec. And because my suspicion is there are probably some legislators, even within the ranks of the Republicans, that are resentful of their heavy-handedness, and would be my guess anyway. So.
All right, well, if no one else has anything else to say, I can't believe it's already 8:30. Thank you all for staying on for an hour and a half.
Actually, I have a question.
Sure.
So, I'm a climate activist for the most part, and like I knew that there was a lot of problems regarding voter suppression and this kind of stuff, but this definitely opened my eyes to realizing it's as bad and worse. And like I feel like with my climate activism, like we do so much. We're always like trying to organize events and stuff, but like the news coming out just keeps getting worse and worse. And like I have a sense that like you guys probably feel similarly, where like these terrible things just keep happening. So I just wanted to know, what's your I mean, how realistic do you think is that we eventually like get into a situation where there's just so much control over the votes that it becomes meaningless, and we just like it's like Hungary, where the democracy is only a surface mask, you could say.
So the one thing that I have seen, the one shining light from all of my research and all of the events that I've attended and stuff like that is I went to a census, actually Lydia, you went to, it was in Houston, it was a census symposium. And they had actually invited a lot of famous demographers to make predictions, because that's what demographers do, about the 2020 elections and just predictions for the next 10 years. And so we were already trending on a path to becoming blue. And that's not what I'm happy about. I'm not necessarily happy that we're turning blue. I do think, though, that Republicans do have an outweighed say in our democracy right now. But because of the Trump effect, there was a very rapid prediction that because of all of this anti-immigrant and anti-everything stance that he has, that has actually fueled Democratic interest and participation. And so we kind of saw a preview of that in the 2018 election. We had a record level turnout of Democrats coming out to vote. So that's going to be amplified in 2020, just as long as we are all capable of doing so in the outbreak with the coronavirus and everything. And so that's why it's important to keep track of what the Secretary of State is saying here right now. Keep in mind that if we do want to have mail-in ballots mailed to us, that the state needs to start printing them basically now in order to have enough ready on hand in November. So that's just something to keep track of. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say, though. So professors and demographic people are are saying that tide turning blue is going to happen sooner rather than later. So it was initially predicted to happen over the course of the next 10 years. And now because of Trump, people are saying, no, that's going to happen even sooner now, within 2020. So
I guess for me, the bottom line is there are a lot of motivating factors that are getting people out and willing to do something, right, to change things. And I think if I were to say anything to you, Joseph, or Joseph, it's to stay involved and to keep doing, because the moment we stop doing is the moment that we will stop trying to fix things. And the history of mankind keeps showing us over and over again that there will always be something to fix. So we'll never be out of work as either proponents or activists, right? That's the good thing, I think. For me, it keeps me out of trouble. It keeps me involved. It keeps me active. It keeps my brain going. And what keeps me going are my great-grandchildren and my grandchildren. And so if I keep that in mind, I don't lose hope in all of this that keeps going on every day, because I have a motive for continuing the fight. And like Stephanie says, the demographics are moving in our direction, right? So that also gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I would just second that and say that, you know, that's what we're up against is far less than what others have been up against. And Steph, you touched upon the mail-in ballots, and I didn't want to raise that because I realized this call was dedicated for redistricting and so forth more. But that if that is such a pressing issue, I'd be curious to hear people's viewpoints, because I had no idea that the ballot printing would have to start this soon. I had the sense that we had plenty of time, and I was thinking in terms of seniors. If you know, I had my loved ones that were at risk of going to the polls come this fall, there's no way I would want them not to have mail-in ballots, and not necessarily just elderly people, but people with whatever conditions that compromise them to the virus. And so anything on that we could, others want to pitch in on? Because why do they have to print them so early? Why couldn't it happen, say, midsummer?
it might. I know for the census questionnaire, it was going to take them a year to how, I guess it was 6 months. So by the time the Supreme Court decision came down last summer, like in the early July, immediately after the Supreme Court decision where they removed the citizenship question from the census questionnaire, they had to start the printers right then and there. Otherwise, they wouldn't have enough questionnaires to mail out to people. So it might be different. They might have enough time, but there is a time limit, right? Because they do have to do that printing and they do have to get it out into the mail and out in time for everyone. And that was actually one of the problems in Wisconsin when the governor realized, like, we have an election coming up, whatever reason that he thought of it so late. That was one of the time restraints, that they didn't have enough questionnaires. They didn't have enough time to get them printed and mailed out to people to expand vote by mail basically there.
Okay. Well, it definitely could synergize what we're trying to do here, because it's very much on people's minds, and is been the experience I've had so far. People have really reacted to it. So anyway, and the latest experts that I've seen were saying there's a very good chance, even if we contain the virus a good bit, that there'll be a reemergence in the fall.
Yeah.
So.
That's what I've seen too. You're not going to have real control of the virus. I used to be a biochemist in drug discovery, so I have a little bit of knowledge. You're not going to have control of the virus until you get a vaccine up to date, or have some sort of prophylactic in place to prevent it from spreading. So I don't see this becoming less of a problem until those two are in place. But you know, in South Korea and China, they do have some more control over it, but that's because they have widespread testing available, which we don't have here in the States. So
yeah, test and trace was the thing I heard about for the long term, for test and trace, where we do the extensive testing and then have a tracing practices, which raises civil liberties. But anyway, I'm kind of rambling on. I'll be quiet now.
Okay, so will we see you all next week, I hope? And same time, we'll be sending out a link, right, Ms. Stephanie, as soon as possible, so that we can see all your beautiful faces again and hear all your wonderful thoughts.
If anyone, by the way, because I hate talking at you guys, if anyone would like to volunteer to take the current event next week, we would love to have you. So just shoot me an email. You can contact me through the website. But I want other people to join in on the conversation and feel like they're taking an active part in the group. So that was my aim for these calls. So please feel free to message me.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, everybody who attended.
Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it.
Here,
All right.
here.
Good night, you all.
Yeah. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate y'all.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.